Hello, everybody. I'm just finishing this up. Hopefully, it won't take me too much long. This is the final conclusion of World War II. We ended with the Pacific Theater. I hope most of that made sense. If you have questions, let me know. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to throw up a discussion. I want you to comment about a couple things, but I'm only going to have you comment on 3 things this time. But one thing I want you to specifically look up right now, and this could be worth points, is I want to know where your great-grandfather was during World War II. Whether he was fighting, whether he was home, I don't care. Whether he didn't fight or not, I want you to tell me what was happening. And if he was fighting, tell me where he was fighting at. Give me some information. This is a big part of your grade. There'll be actually I'll attach an assignment thing with it, so you'll notice. But I want you to look up some information, and you'll fill out the assignment, and then I want you to tell me on the discussion board about what you found out about your grandparent. I think we have a deep connection with this war, and it's important that we remember that this war touched almost everybody's life. It was unavoidable. I've had students from Central America, South America, Africa who have found out ways that the war has impacted them. So that's what I need you to see. Even if they didn't directly fight in the war, how did they get involved in this war? So with that being said, let's get moving on to the European theater. We just went over the Pacific theater. Like the European theater, there are phases to those, so we're going to quickly go over that. Phase 1 is called the African theater, or the African campaign. And that's going to happen from about 1942 into 1943. Second thing will be known as the Italian landings, or Operation Husky, is how it's referred to. Right, Husky instead of landing. And that's going to be from about 1943 into 1945, so all the way to the end of the war. The third one, sort of the big one, right, is the Normandy landings. Of course, you guys might know that as D-Day. That's June 1944. And then finally, what we call the breakout. From Normandy. And that's from roughly June 1944 to, 4 is here, May 1945. So we'll go through all of them, but we'll primarily spend most of the time on 3 and 4. Well, let's take a look here at what's happening in Europe. One thing that Hitler believed, and let me just kind of, it's too bad that we can't spend more time looking at this guy, but I will give you a little brief background about him. One of the major things he believed in was not a state, not a political country, but a racial superiority. The superior race, the Aryan race, the German race. And what he believed is that the natural cycle of the world was to get rid of, think social Darwinism here, the lesser races, what he'd call subhuman and inhuman races. And that would be, Jews would be the inhuman, and then Slavs and African Americans and others would be considered the subhuman. And he believed that there needed to be a cleansing. And so he had convinced Germany, and remember we started this conversation with Versailles. He convinced Germany that the problem with what was happening was this was a Jewish conspiracy. And the Jews were behind the Versailles movement that completely crippled Germany. Hitler believed that the Jews were responsible for World War I and for most of the financial problems around Germany and the world. And so, you know, what happened, and it was very brilliant of him, he chose an easy target, right? He chose a target that was you could exploit. You know, you couldn't go to war with France again or England again yet, so you had to find an enemy that you could rally behind, and the Germans were okay with this. And there's a very interesting book called Hitler's Willing Executioners who talks about this, that, you know, look, this is This is a thing that not just Hitler believed, but a lot of people bought into back then. Of course, it leads to the Holocaust. So, with that being said, we don't get involved in this war for a while. Um, Hitler, like, come back to Battle of Britain. So Hitler actually has this very insane movement. He calls it the Blitzkrieg, which is this lightning army, and he's sweeping across, Europe. He first goes to Poland in September, Czechoslovakia before that a little bit, and then he has this sort of pretend pact with Russia, and then he swings west. So jump out here. So he goes to Poland first, then he swings west and takes France, and he doesn't touch Spain. Spain's in this sort of like no man's land there in the Civil War, and he tries to go after Great Britain, but Great Britain, of course, is an island. It protects him. It leads to the very important Battle of Britain, where the British Air Force was able to hold their ground and sort of stop this ball moving. Once that happens, Hitler then focuses all of his attention on capturing Soviet Union. He breaks his pact. And a lot of it is he wants to take this land, but he also believes that the Slavs are subhuman people. So they need to be removed, and the Jews are. He's disappointed the Soviet Unions are so friendly to the communists and the Jews. So then he focuses on that area, moving over there. Okay. Battle of Britain, like I said, this is what sort of stops Hitler from moving west, but probably the most important battle in world history, you could argue, is the Stalingrad, Battle of Stalingrad. And here, this will be the moment of truth, as the Soviets and the Germans will fight here, and it will be brutal. Up to 2 million dead. It's one of the coldest winters, and Germans talk about how they're freezing to death here. But that'll be most important battle of this war, probably. I know people don't say it because we're not involved with it, but truthfully, if it wasn't for the Stalingrad, the Germans would have kept pushing and probably have taken Moscow, and then they could have focused completely on just protecting the western border. Okay, so our plan here, and once that we're in here, is really three things. We're going to weaken the economy of the Germans by bombing them. And we're going to undermine the civilian morale, and then we really want to take out the German Air Force. So those are three things that we're going to try to do. One of the most important questions is, how do we get into Europe? And this will be Ike's challenge. Ike, of course, is Dwight D. Eisenhower, who will be general of the European theater and eventual president, which we'll talk about. Let me come back to the map to show you. So there's a couple places where we're trying to figure out where to come in at. This is the most obvious, but it's also the most guarded place. So when we're looking, okay, let's maybe come in here. We could go through Italy, but you have the Alps here, so that makes it hard to go over the Alps. This place is not really accessible. These are too rocky, these shores. So, we're pretty predictable. We decided to come into Italy, and this is the Italian landings. And we decided to come into Great Britain. One of the first things that we really want to do is to kick the Nazis out of Africa. One thing that Hitler was thinking was to control and keep the Mediterranean in his possession like this. This is very similar to what the Romans would do. Well, we come into West Africa, so England's going to come this way at Al Alamein. We're going to come this way from Morocco, and this is where we start fighting the Nazis. And it was all great. I mean, in this first campaign, we do pretty well in the fight in North Africa. The problem is that Russia wants us here. Russia, Stalingrad, or Stalin, who's the premier, the president of Russia, sends this sort of telegram saying, hey, we need you to help us in Europe. It's nice that you're doing things in North Africa, but we really need you there. But we do manage to kick the Germans out of North Africa. You can see here's sort of a map of where we came in at, different locations. And it was important, but we really needed to get to Europe. Well, the same with the Italian landings. We land here, and England will take over here on what is considered the eastern coast, and we come up the west coast. And it's pretty brutal at times, but it's a slow-moving moment here. By the time we're up here in Milan and Venice, that we've already broken through at Normandy. And that leads us to the third one, which I told you we would spend most of the time on, which is right here. This is the most guarded coastline you can see here. And so we're trying to figure out, how do we break in? It leads us right to D-Day, June 6, 1944. And it is unbelievable. So let me talk about it for a few minutes. I'm going to use this to show you the plan. This was the most secret map and decision that we have done in world history. No, only a handful of people knew the location. And to kind of help you out, this is sort of a panoramic view. So here's Britain. This is the landing zone. We choose five landing zones in a 50-mile stretch called Normandy. Within this stretch, we plan on just sort of overwhelming the German defenses. The first thing we'll do is send paratroopers across lines right in here. So we'll land paratroopers here. And then we will shell with our guns the beachhead. From there, we will land troops and have them, take the beach and then break on through to Germany. The British help out at two places, and the Canadians at Juno and Sword and Gold. And then we take the brunt of it. Utah is brutal, but by far the most damaging place was Omaha. And that's where our 5th Corps comes in here. Okay, so let me actually want to skip ahead here, and then I'll come back to the video. It's kind of interesting. Let's talk about kind of the phases within the 3rd phase. So at 2 a.m., we drop our paratroopers, 13,000 behind enemy lines here. Now, this is dangerous because if we don't break through, they're stuck here. But the idea is once we break, they come in this way. We sandwich them. About 1 a.m., we send a phantom army. And this is interesting because we send a bunch of ships. And we want Germany to see them. They're not full of troops. They look like they're full of troops. So we're hoping that the Germans shift some of their artillery down to try to convince them. And it does work, actually. Some do shift over, thinking that we were going to attack somewhere else. Kind of a fake army. Phase 3, 300 planes dropped 13,000 bombs on all these locations. Pretty crazy. And then at 5 a.m., that's when we throw all these kind of naval bombs at them. Finally, 6:30 a.m., we start our landing there at Utah and Omaha. Let me actually wanted to see if I can do this. What's the best way to do this? This should work. Let me I wish I had a blank map here to do this, but I really don't. So I'm just going to use this right here. Okay, let's just forget the picture in the background for a second. Let me kind of explain something. Let's say, let's say this is the way the coastline is, okay? That'll kind of make sense to you. So here's the beach right here. Okay, here's the water. Okay, we'll make sense of that there. Beachhead, we'll kind of label it beach, water, and this is the bluff, right? And this is where they have their guns. Now, as we land with our ships here and run across the beach, they're trying to take us out, right? So we have these things called Higgins boats, and what they are is they're shaped kind of like this, and they have a drawbridge, so they come down. So troops run out, get on the beachhead, and then try to go here. And these Higgins boats work pretty well, except that the gunfire, they're shooting right at the front of the drawbridge, so they know that when they come down, they're going to run out. The first 15 soldiers are going to get plowed, so it's real ugly. And the Rangers are the first ones off on the beach here. And so here's a Higgins boat right there. And they're going to run as fast as they can and try to take this over. So let's watch a little clip about it.
Well, D-Day was obviously the most important single fight of that war. And, of course, had we lost it, there's no telling what the outcome would have been.
Since the American entry into the war, American generals had been agitating for an opportunity to fight the Germans directly. The D-Day invasion of Normandy in June 1944, represented the cutting edge of this offensive.
Essential condition that underwrote the success of D-Day was the fact that Germany had been bled virtually to death by fighting on the Eastern Front for several years against the Red Army in the Soviet Union before D-Day ever happened.
The Germans had been preparing for this invasion as long as the Americans and the British had been, and they had been digging in. And they knew that they could inflict appalling casualties on the first units ashore. Well, somebody had to do it. And so the soldiers went, and indeed, those first units did suffer very high rates of death and wounding.
It's one thing to go on a beach with sand dunes. It's something else when you've got enemy on top of these bluffs. And for some reason, our naval gunnery was either off or something went wrong there. They couldn't destroy those gun emplacements.
But eventually, the weight of the invasion took hold. The numbers of Americans, the numbers of craft, allowed the Americans and the British to establish a beachhead. And once they established a beachhead, then they could bring more and more soldiers and equipment ashore.
One thing I don't think either the Japanese or the Germans really counted on was what it meant to come up against a massive capitalist industrial power. The ability to build stuff on a massive scale with massive numbers was just something they hadn't really anticipated.
If you look back at the old photographs and the footage of that armada out there off the coast, I don't think they've ever assembled before or after anything like that.
Eventually, it was the technology, it was the weight of American weapons that tipped the balance. But at the very beginning, it was the soldiers, the ones who splashed ashore, the ones who knew that in the first wave, lots and lots of them would never come back. And those are the ones who made possible everything that followed.
The Rangers who went in first and the waves that came after them stood right up to it. There was more bravery that day than one can hardly imagine.
Well, maybe one of your grandparents fought on it. I don't know, but do some research for me and let's figure it out. So, I love this. They did this picture here of an artist went out and stenciled in the sand all the dead bodies, the 9,000 Americans that were killed here at D-Day. And it's pretty cool, right? Didn't last long as the waves came and the tide came washed away. But so for a few minutes, he drew this panoramic of what it was. He had tons of people volunteering to help him do it. Some more pictures of D-Day so you can see the magnitude like they were talking about in the film of how big this is. Okay, once we break out, it's about how fast can we get to Germany? How fast can we get to Berlin? And I'll talk about why that is, but one man who's leading the way is in charge of the Third Army. His name's George Patton, and this dude's tough. He can play around. He's cut out of the same cloth as Douglas MacArthur, and he once punched a soldier in the face because he was crying. He didn't really care, right? He wanted to win. He once had a great quote that said, "The object of war is to kill the bastard before you become the bastard who gets killed." I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but something like that. And so he was really about pushing and moving and sort of what it means to be a soldier through and through. The last real battle which slows us down is the Battle of the Bulge. And this was what we call the Wacht am Rhein. It was the last ditched effort from Hitler to try to stop the Americans from moving into Germany. And it was a complete surprise. And what they did is they used the weather. They kind of knew that bad weather was coming. So the Air Force was what the fear was. They didn't want the Air Force to help. And so when the weather was bad, they completely attacked us. We didn't see it coming. By the Ardennes Forest in December of 1944. And it ends up being really bloody. It's super cold at this time. We got some soldiers freezing to death. One more video about this to show you how brutal Bulge was. So actually lose more troops at Bulge than any other battle that we fought in. Let me get this to work here. Let's try that again here. For some reason, it's not wanting to load the video, so we'll see if it... Well, we're just going to skip that. It's not working. But let's keep moving here. Once we do get past the Germans, because the air actually clears up and the Air Force is able to come in right at Bastogne when we're about ready to get destroyed. Here comes the Air Force. In March 1945, we find a bridge and we cross the Rhine, which is the river, and we make it into Germany. The Soviets at this point, though, because of the Battle of the Bulge, had already taken most of Europe. And if I can get this one to work, let's see if I can. This is a really cool little time lapse that shows you how fast the Russians were able to make it in there and why this is a race. When I'm trying to get this load up, I'll explain a little bit about what I mean by the race. So once we knew we were going to win this war, it was really now a decision, a kind of a race. You had the Soviet Union, who were our allies. We were fighting with them, but they believed in communism. They were much different than we were economically and politically. Of course, we believed in democracy and capitalism. And so we wanted to liberate Europe and all these places and get there before they did. So I don't know what's going on with my videos. Let me see if I can get it to work this way. Well, I don't know if we'll be able to see this video. That's really a bummer. Technology, right? Okay, well, I don't know. Okay, well, let's keep moving. Well, the Soviet Union will make it in Berlin before America will. And so I love this one of the most famous pictures. This is the Soviet Union waving a flag over the Reichstag, over the government building in Berlin, showing that the Russians had defeated Hitler and his massive army. On April 30th, 1945, Adolf Hitler and his lover, his woman, Eva Braun, will go into a bunker and they will kill themselves, and thus officially ending the war in Europe. One of the more difficult questions out there that gets asked by historians is, what did the Americans know about the Holocaust? What did we know? Well, there were rumors, especially places like New York, where Jews were talking about their destruction of their people, the genocide of their own people. But we didn't know. I mean, I would argue we didn't know as much. We didn't know it was this bad. And so, we watched this whole thing sort of crumble. And when our GIs finally come up to these horrible conditions by these soldiers, some of them weep because of what they're seeing. And you guys have seen the videos and the pictures, I'm sure, before. But, here's a Jewish man explaining to the GIs what it was like in there. It's just rough situation. In 1944, the president is ill, but he is reelected for a fourth term, unbelievable, just to sort of finish out the war. He brings in a vice president named Harry Truman. Churchill, Stalin, and FDR, seeing that things are falling apart, believe that maybe three of them can meet together and solve this out. But the problem is that Stalin and FDR and Churchill, they're on different pages, right? They don't see the same thing. Well, the big question was, how do we get Japan to surrender? Europe surrenders, Germany surrenders, but what about Japan? Remember this idea of honor. Well, a very famous scientist named Robert Oppenheimer develops the nuclear weapon in Los Alamos, New Mexico. And we sort of decide this is the only way we feel like we can win this war, is by dropping this bomb. And I did have a video here, but since none of my videos are working, I might have to show it to you next time because this is not working. But okay, so that's really World War II. And I know there's so much more, but I want to hear from you now. What was most interesting that you learned about? And then come back and tell me about your relative. Okay, guys, that's it. We'll be back.